Well, first of all, walking is a very spiritual practice. And that's why our title is Every Step of Prayer, because in our longer pieces, we have Karina Gold who's saying every step is a prayer. So we wanted to people, especially those who are non-native, to really put into mind what that means to be walking in prayer and to be silent. And a couple of times too, I mean, we really had to be guardians of that spirituality. Just in terms of my own family's history, we were marched from the Southeast to Oklahoma. So there's tinges of the death march for me in my family's history. And then that certainly wasn't in a lot of ways a spiritual practice. But one of the elders I interviewed some time ago, he was a flute player. He made his own flutes. And he asked me about a couple of things and said, do you know why we put blankets on our over our caskets when we bury someone? It could either be a Pendleton or it could be a star quilt or something. I said, no, I really don't. And he said, it's because we were in such a rush. If someone died on the trail, we would wrap them in a blanket and leave them by the side of the road. And he said, we also had songs that were created just for that journey that others couldn't understand because it was in our language, but it was really to tell the people to keep strong, to carry on. We can do that. So I think embedded in my history is that notion of walking, one in a prayerful way just to survive, and the one in an activist way to create new things that you want. And I think that is a whole different approach. Being an urban raised Native woman is very different. We have respect for the land because that's what we've been taught. But it's different when you're outside of your area where your creation stories are. I didn't go back to Oklahoma until after my father passed away, a good 10 years after he passed away. So all the work that I was doing as a student, I didn't get to ask my father those questions at all. So what I did was ask every relative that I could that was still living, that would give me sort of that information about my father. And going back to Oklahoma, being around a lot of tribal people, family members, all of a sudden you're in the majority and you're not in the minority, or you're not invisible. You're there in the midst of it. And particularly going to stomp dances and to our most spirituals, our green corn ceremony, there's a feeling that you don't get when you're in an urban environment, even though you respect the people whose land you're living on. It's not the same as the land that you came from. So even in Oklahoma, that's not our Aboriginal land. You know, Florida was. And so when I went back to Florida for the first time, actually first and only time, I went to where one of our significant treaties was signed by myself, just out there. And that's when I felt this strong, strong connection to that land and to the treaty by which we lost that land. So for me, it's an inherent responsibility to all land, whether it's the California native land, the Ohlone land that I'm living on. All of that is to recognize that everything came from a spiritual base. The borders, the medicine line, all of those are really fabricated entities, made up entities, and they don't really reflect, one, the sacredness of land, the sacredness of water, air, and everything, because of the way people have abused and misused it. Also important for me too is, how do I leave this legacy to my children and grandchildren? I mean, if they don't see me standing up for something, will they ever stand up for something? The spiritual walk nourishes your body in the way that it's moving, but it also nourishes inside. Certainly in the 1960s, people felt compelled to join those movements. So I think in us, we have sort of this mainstream side of the family who sort of went along and did whatever. And then we have this very activist side of the family that stood up. And walking is such a part of that. Think about elders doing those walks. And for us as grandmothers, that's why every sort of action we did, we put the grandmothers at the front, the women at the front, with the idea while we're doing these walks and while we're being in prayer, if there's some sort of violence going to happen, we thought the police would be more reluctant to hit a bunch of grandmothers, especially when it's being filmed. Now, in the past, I mean, that did not mean anything when it came to Ames activism and persecution of the people in trials and the beatings that people sustained during that time. But even though those events happened and occurred, we had to go back to the idea, why are we walking? What are we doing this for? And instill in people, in younger people too, that this is your legacy. So when we're gone, you have to carry this on. You have to do this. And the stories that came out of that and the things that happened from those events that get told to the next generation are the ones that fuel the next generation to say, my auntie did it, my grandmother did it. So it's incumbent on me to stand up to when I'm called. You're always weighing what's going to end up, am I going to be clubbed by a police officer, actually at Standing Rock, by private security, militant private security? What's going to be the reaction to that? And for some people, it doesn't matter. It's like, I'm going to stand up anyway, even though they're going to throw me in a dog cage and they're going to keep me there. And I have all these charges against me. Because at the bottom of that, our people didn't give up. My people, the Seminole people, never signed a peace treaty with the United States. So part of me has that legacy in mind too, that my people fought in the Everglades and they fought to keep that homeland and they stayed there. And the people that marched on that trail where they cried, they also were survivors and they really didn't want to go on that walk. They wept when they left. So if we can look back at that history and if people can know that history, then they can understand why we walk, why we do the things that we do. And every time there's a flaring at the refineries and something else comes out about that, I know the communities that are being affected. And if I don't do something, don't say something, or bring the attention to the rest of the world about this, I mean, what kind of modeling will I have done for my children and grandchildren? It's extremely important to carry that on and to realize too, and keep in your mind, every step is a prayer. It may hurt and you may be tired. Every person at that walk was important. Whatever your role was, it was a cog in the huge machine that we were trying to bring attention to. I think people in the world have to be in such complete denial about the connections between world economies and the destruction of natural resources. And for me, everything is connected. If you do something, it's like a spider web. If you tug on the spider web, it's going to hit on the other side of the spider web. And that's what our whole world is about, a massive spider web and a massive tugging that's going on. Unfortunately, the people with the least power, and I mean that economically, I don't mean that spiritually or in any other way, I mean economically, who don't have the power to resist in other ways, is to stand up, to actually put our lives on the line, put our bodies on the line to show people. There's never been in history such a wide gap between the wealthiest and the poorest people. And it just gets wider and wider each day. And people still aren't linking that this causes devastations. It's not if a spill happens, it's when a spill happens. And if it's on like DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, where's it going to spill? It's going to spill on native land. I don't know more, San Francisco Bay came up with the term refinery corridor. So people who didn't even know there were 5 refineries in the Bay Area would understand how it's not linked just in geography, and that geography being in the most socioeconomically devastated communities, but there were connections between each one of the refineries. And when there was a flaring or an explosion or something, those are long lasting effects that happen. They don't just go away and, oh, we've had an explosion, they cleaned it up. No, those stay into the groundwater. The people in Richmond have much, much higher incidence of health problems, of asthma, of cancer, of all kinds of diseases that can be directly linked to the devastation of the refineries. I mean, the local people are not benefiting from the refineries and from the fracking. They bring people from the outside in. I think people's understanding about what is sacred to us, the land we walked on, the land that you're on, is very important for all life, not just for our lives, but your life as well. Every walk started with us gathering water from wherever we were and bringing it in and saying a prayer over the water, because we carried, different people carried the water, a bucket of water that we had prayed over the entire 10 miles or 8 miles or 9 miles. Somebody carried it the whole way. And we put all of our prayers in the water. And we know that water responds to prayers. We know that crystals form in ice. If you yell at them one way, they become oddly shaped. If you pray over them, they're symmetrical and beautiful. So saying prayers with water is for everyone who uses that water or drinks that water. Those prayers stay in the water. This is where our origin stories are. This is the rock. This is the tree. This is the lake that tells us how long we've been here. So how do you bridge that gap? I mean, how do you really come across that gap? And I think is do it in the most human way.